Mouin, what's your recollection? First of all, how did you get there? You were a Dutch citizen. How did you end up in the First Intifada in the West Bank?
Well, when the shortly before the uprising broke out, I was then in my final year of university in the United States, and I was hoping to do my doctorate in Middle East history, and I'd never lived in the Middle East, so I thought before beginning my doctorate, I should maybe, spend a year in the Middle East, and several friends suggested that I spend a year teaching at one of the Palestinian universities in the West Bank. So in late November 1987, this is, before email, I sent out letters to Birzeit University, to Bethlehem University, to Najah University in Nablus, inquiring about a possibility of getting a teaching position there for a year. And through friends who had personal connections to a human rights organization in Ramallah named Al-Haq, they suggested that for good measure, I throw in an application there too. At the time, I was quite skeptical of the idea of struggling for human rights in the context of occupation. It seemed to me you either have occupation or national liberation, and the idea of promoting human rights in the context of occupation struck me as somewhat absurd in my younger days. But that notwithstanding, I humored them and did it. By the time my letters arrived in Palestine, Intifada had erupted. The Israeli military had shut down all the universities. And several months later, I started getting responses, well, thanks for your interest, but there won't be an academic year next year because we've been closed down by the Israeli military. While at the same time, all of a sudden, the human rights organizations had this crying need for more researchers. So I was able to get a position as a researcher with Al-Haq. I remember, my Palestinian political education, such as it was, had been very much formed by the experiences of the Palestinian national movement in exile, in Jordan and Lebanon, and their diplomatic efforts around the world. And I was less familiar with the occupied territories, and I didn't really have a very good understanding of either its geography, its society, its politics, and so on. And I remember, I first went there in June 88. So this was about 6-7 months after the Intifada erupted. Little anecdote, since it's now World Cup season. It was then the 1988 European Cup, and I was leaving to Palestine via Tel Aviv airport from Amsterdam the day after the Netherlands won the European Cup. And in those days, you get to the airport and there would be security officials going through your suitcase and interrogating you. And the first question that I was asked by the Dutch security officer is, where were you last night? And I was kind of taken aback by the question. And I responded, well, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean you don't know? I said, well, I watched the game. Holland won, Bedlam broke out. And I just remember having a few drinks afterwards, and then the rest is kind of a black hole. And he gave me a sympathetic look and he said, yeah, I have a splitting headache too. Off you go. And that was that. And then on the flight, I somehow got stuck with a group of Latin American Christian pilgrims, and perhaps at passport control in Tel Aviv, maybe they thought I was one of them, and I was more or less waved right through. And, that's how I got there. And it was a fascinating experience at many times, as Musa has said, tragic and infuriating, but also at others, very hopeful and at times even euphoric. I had the opportunity to visit virtually every town, village, and refugee camp in the West Bank and Gaza Strip by going around with the field workers of Al-Haq, and got to know the area reasonably well and its society and its politics. And my recollection is that it was, at least initially, a very hopeful period because many of the social and political barriers were broken, and people were acting very much collectively in the common interest, looking out for each other, working together, making individual sacrifices for the collective good in ways that had not happened before, or to a much more limited extent. And I think Musa is right that over time, for a variety of factors, including some that Musa has mentioned, that began to fray. And unfortunately, it did end up with the catastrophe of the Oslo agreements. I personally do not think that was a foregone conclusion. I think there were other options. To me, a key turning point was in March, April 1988. This is before I got there, but there had been a proposal that the Palestinian residents of the occupied territories should collectively either destroy or hand back their identity cards that are issued by the Israeli authorities, and were absolutely instrumental in their system of population control. And for whatever reason, both the local and the national leadership decided not to pursue that option. It was, I think, at that point, there was a fork in the road of making the occupied territories completely ungovernable, or giving Israel a route back to exercising even more stringent controls along the lines of what Musa has described.
I want to just make, I much prefer to hear you all, but I just want to say, just make a couple of comments because you stimulated many memories. I remember when a Palestinian's identity card was taken, as it was by the Israelis,
routinely,
you couldn't move. I remember Musa telling me the stories that he just had to stay in a single place for a very long time because the Israelis had taken his identity card. So he physically could not.
They exchanged it with the green, it was, orange, cover. And, most activists were given green cover. And it was, dangerous to, pass on soldiers. When they saw just the green, you had to be beaten or held for hours, and sometimes arrested again.
If I could just make one observation, you're entirely right what you say about the identity cards, but the 1980s were a very different period when Israel was still very reliant on Palestinian labor in agriculture, in construction, in services, in other sectors, and they were able to take as many identity cards as they wanted and confiscate them because there were still tens of thousands of others who they could rely on. But it was my view.
I wasn't criticizing.
I understand. I'm just clarifying that the reason this could have worked is because Israel then was not, I believe, in a position to collectively ban the entire population of the occupied territories in the way that it is very much able to do today.
Mouin, I have a question about that specifically, since you're familiar with like the labor situation and the educational situation in the 80s in Palestine and Israel. So at the time there was this, so there were the school closures, right? I believe the biggest university in the West Bank was closed.
All universities.
Yeah.
And all schools.
Yeah, and some of them were closed like literally for like 18 months straight, right, at a time. I mean, people are going wild in the West now about, coronavirus school closures, what effects does this have on students? Well, we had literally 18 months of no education at all. And at the time, though, it reminds me a little bit of maybe what was going on in Iran after the White Revolution, where suddenly you had a more educated youth, but at the same time, the kinds of jobs that were available to them in Iran was also, as well as in Palestine in the 80s, it's like you said, it was menial physical labor, right? So it was to the extent that Palestinians were allowed to work in Israel, it was all supposed to be for manual labor. Can you just comment a little bit more about what was happening in the labor situation?
Yeah, first of all, during this period, 88, 89, education was literally criminalized, whether at the primary, secondary, or tertiary level. And educational activities were conducted underground illegally. Now, as far as the labor situation is concerned, you're right with an important distinction, which is that those who either had attained a higher level of education or had obtained professional qualifications, on the whole, could not find work either within the occupied territories or in Israel unless they accepted jobs that were far below their qualifications. But they did have the opportunity to find work, particularly in the Gulf states, in the Arab states on the Persian Gulf. International migration was then much easier than it was today. But I think one factor that contributed to the Intifada is that during the second half or during much of the 1980s, the Gulf labor market began to diminish considerably. I should add that this was a model that worked very well for the Israelis, because often you would get educated Palestinian professionals who then would move to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to wherever, and would essentially take up permanent long-term residence there. And so it was, on the one hand, one less Palestinian on the land that the Israelis coveted, and at the same time, it was often these more economically secure, more educated Palestinians that played leadership roles, and that was, one less activist to be jailed or deported.